Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I tell you, it's good to be back here on Now TV. The last video that I was able to do was June the 2nd, as I remember it, and so here we are, well over a month later, and most of you, many of you at least, who watch my regular morning musings on YouTube, know the difficulty I've been having with my voice. I completely lost my voice. I wasn't able to film for a good little bit. Uh, I've been trying everything under the sun, basically, to try to get it back. And I wanted to try to record a video for today, and I've been able to film my regular morning musings. Those are generally about 15 minutes each. I managed to do that a little bit this week, and yet by the time I talk for, you know, 30, 45 minutes, my voice is very weak. I had a conversation with my nephew about a week ago, and we stayed on the phone for 30 minutes. And by the time I got off the phone, my voice just was almost non existent. I mean, it was really bad. Now, needless to say, that's extremely frustrating for someone whose ministry at the present time is involved with, to a great extent, in producing videos. I told my voice doctor here a little while back about my frustration. I said, look, as a minister and someone who produces videos 5 days a week, plus a radio program that we record, video as well, and a TV program, I said, I've got to have my voice and my brain, my mind. I said, now there might be times when I could do without my mind, but I got to have my voice. Uh, So it is very exasperating, but I'm glad to be back with you today. I'm going to do my very dead level best to get through and to say something worthwhile. So I appreciate you being with me. Now, before I go on, here we are almost at the end of July 2023, and since I last filmed, I introduced a brand spanking new book entitled All Things, These Are the Days When All Things Must Be Fulfilled. It is one of the most in-depth exegesis of Luke 21 and 22 that you're going to find anywhere. In a passage that even dispensationalists admit is talking about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, Jesus said, "These be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled." Now, let's face it. If Jesus was saying that by the time of the fall of Jerusalem, all prophecy, all things written, would be fulfilled, then all futurist views of eschatology are completely blown out of the water. And we are forced to take the full preterist view. Well, needless to say, that causes futurists to go, almost into apoplectic fits, say, oh, well, no, that's not what Jesus was saying. He was saying only the prophecies concerning the fall of Jerusalem, all of them, would be fulfilled by AD 70. Well, I agree with that. But that's a fatal argument. It actually proves that all prophecy, all of it, prophecies concerning the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, new creation, they would all be fulfilled by AD 70. Now, how can I say that? It is because of this, and obviously this is very brief because I want to get into my video for today. But the point of fact is, in the Old Testament and in the New as well, every constituent element of the end times, coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, new creation, those prophecies are inextricably bound up with the time of the judgment of Israel and destruction of Jerusalem. I document this extensively in this brand new book. Now, there's a whole lot more I could say about this, but in the book, I examine the major arguments that I've ever heard to counter the apparent words of Jesus. I give the proper biblical answer to that, And then I explore several different other related aspects of how, guess what? AD 70 was in fact to be the time when all prophecy, all eschatological promises were to be fulfilled. Okay, this book will regularly sell for $18.95 plus $4.95 shipping. For the rest of this month, July 2023, and U.S. orders only, total delivered price $16.95. Go to my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Beautiful banner right up at the very top, okay? Click on the banner, order the book. I want to tell you, the evidence to support, to prove, to validate the claim that all eschatological prophecies, every one of them, were fulfilled by the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Folks, this book changes everything. So let me encourage you to get a copy of this book. Now, the last time I was with you and able to talk somewhat, I shared with you, and we have been looking at the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is taken from John chapter 10, verse 37. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Don't believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works. That's what Jesus was saying. Now, those things that Jesus said he was going to do was his coming, the judgment, the resurrection, etc. Now that means, at least on one primary level, that if Jesus did not come, if the judgment did not take place, if the resurrection has not taken place, Jesus said, don't believe him. And somebody responds by saying, well, now look, Preston, are you saying that his resurrection was not important and does not give us faith? I'm not saying that in any way, shape, form, or fashion, but notice how that argument, how that objection comes back. Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Okay? Jesus said, Matthew 16, Matthew 20, 21, 22, the Son of Man was going to go up to Jerusalem, be crucified, buried, raised again the third day. So here's a question for you. If he was not raised from the dead, are we to believe in him? I actually had one theology student tell me one time, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. And I just told the young man, I said, well, it's evident that you and I don't have much to talk about because Paul said, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. And he goes, well, I don't accept that. I said, well, that's your prerogative, but it's what the Apostle Paul said. If Christ is not risen, in other words, if Jesus didn't keep his word to raise himself from the dead, if Jesus did not do that, we're not supposed to believe in him. We cannot believe in him if he wasn't raised from the dead. Okay, if that's true, why is it not equally true that if he did not come in judgment, in the resurrection in the first century, that we're supposed to still believe on him? You see, Jesus didn't say, okay, the totality of your faith will be based upon my resurrection. That was simply one of the things that he said he was going to do. Do you realize, and I'm not saying this is more important, I'm simply saying it's a fact, it's a numerical fact. Do you realize that the Bible mentions coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection more than it mentions the resurrection of Jesus? And again, I'm not saying that the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection is more important. Jesus wasn't going to be able to come unless he had been resurrected. Okay? The resurrection is the foundation. But it's part of a holistic package of things that Jesus said he was going to do. And he said, if I don't do these things, do not believe on me. And you know, in April of this year, 2023, I had a debate with a man who used to be a Christian. He's now an atheist because he had the literalistic, physical concept of the coming of the Lord, the judgment and the resurrection that most people still do today. Because Jesus didn't come back literally, physically, as a 5'5" Jewish man in the first century, this man abandoned his faith. By the way, that debate can be found on my YouTube video. It's a debate between Mark Smith and Don K. Preston. Look it up. Watch the debate. You'll see how Mark Smith did not fare well at all in that debate. He lost hands down. So what we've been trying to do is to share with you only the full preterist view is able to meet the challenge of Christ and to prove that Jesus did come in the first century, in judgment, in the resurrection, just like he promised to do. Okay? The way we've been doing that is pointing out that the book of Revelation says the time has drawn near. The time has come for the fulfillment of prophecy. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. These things must shortly come to pass. The time is drawn near. The word time there is the Greek word kairos, and it means designated, divinely appointed, divinely designated time. And what John was saying is that God has appointed a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness. Acts chapter 17, 30 and 31. The Old Testament likewise speaks of the appointed time of the last days. When the last days arrived, those eschatological promises and prophecies of the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection, when the last days would arrive, fulfillment would be near. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 22, the Lord said, when it arrives, in that day, I will bring it to pass swiftly. In other words, in its day, when the time comes for fulfillment, fulfillment would happen quickly. Okay, when the appointed time for the prophecies to be fulfilled, when that time came, and here's a critical point, that time was not in the Old Testament. The prophets knew, according to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10 and following, the prophets knew that the things that they were prophesying about, even the sacrifice of Jesus, his incarnation, his resurrection, and his coming, the judgment resurrection, they knew that they were not speaking of their own day. They were speaking of things far off. I know that because Daniel chapter 10 and chapter 12 emphatically tell us that Daniel was speaking of events far off when he was talking about the judgment, the great tribulation, the resurrection, the kingdom, the time of the end. Daniel was told, Daniel, seal up the words of this vision for the time. The appointed time of the end is for many days to come. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 13, Daniel, go your way until the end of the days. That's the literal Hebrew there. The end of the days. So seal the book, Daniel. And the Septuagint of Daniel chapter 12, verse 13 says, for there shall be many days and hours until the full end. Don't you find it fascinating that Daniel was told there will be many days and hours until the consummation. Jesus in his ministry said the appointed time, the appointed time for fulfillment had arrived. Mark chapter 1, verse 15. The time is fulfilled. The kairos is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is drawn near. Okay? So many days and hours had passed. And then we come to Acts chapter 1, and the apostles, knowing that they were living in the appointed time, said, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus said, it is not for you to know the day and the hour. The hemeron, horon, or horai, plural. You see, they were living in the time. They were living in the time after many days and hours had passed. And yet Jesus is saying, days and hours, go into the city and wait until you be endued with power from on high. But you see, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit would indicate, number one, they truly were in the last days, just like Jesus had been teaching them. The time is fulfilled. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he said, save yourselves from this untoward generation. Do you see how all of that flows together, ladies and gentlemen, to prove that the appointed time of the end truly was in the first century? It was not millennia removed. Now, to get back to Daniel chapter 9, I've been sharing with you that Daniel chapter 9, which, according to F.F. Bruce and many other commentators, was undoubtedly the prophecy that Jesus had in mind when he said the time is fulfilled. Because as Bruce points out, the language that Jesus used indicates that a prophecy had been given a long time before. The time of which it spoke had not been near, but now the time which had been designated, appointed, divinely appointed, that divinely appointed time had arrived, and because the kingdom had arrived, the time was near. Just like Isaiah 60:22 says, in its time, I will bring it to pass quickly. In its time. Jesus said, the time is fulfilled. So, we've been looking at the constituent elements of Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. 70 weeks are determined to make atonement. 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression. And I've been examining with you, sharing with you, how that term, finish the transgression, according numerous Hebrew scholars, Bible scholars, linguists, commentators, that terminology means to fill up the measure of sin. Now, that is a common Old Testament prophetic theme, as we have shared. Daniel said 70 weeks are determined to finish, to fill up the measure of sin. In our last video, which has been over a month ago now, I'm sure you've forgotten it. Let me encourage you to go back to that video. I'll only hit a few points very, very briefly because I'm running out of time today. But in that prophecy, all right, 70 weeks are determined to fill up the measure of sin. Jesus said that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin in his generation by killing the apostles and prophets. Okay. And yet people tell us, well, the 70 weeks were fulfilled at the cross. I'm sorry, all prophecy was not fulfilled by the cross. Now, we'll have a whole lot more to say about about sealing vision and prophecy in upcoming programs. But the filling up the measure of sin on the part of Israel wasn't completed at the cross. As I pointed out in the last video, Jesus said that Israel's filling up of the measure of her sin would not be completed until Israel had killed his apostles and prophets. Some people then say, well, yeah, the 70 weeks were fulfilled with the stoning of Stephen. Stephen was not an apostle. But Jesus said Israel would fill up the measure of their sin by killing his apostles and prophets. And by the way, as we shall see later, 70 weeks are determined to seal vision and prophecy. To seal vision and prophecy means to fulfill all prophecy, thus bringing the prophetic office to its completion and termination. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? All prophecy was not fulfilled at the time of the stoning of Stephen. As I prove in this book, Jesus' own emphatic words are, as he spoke of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, as virtually everyone admits, these are the days of vengeance when all things that are written must be fulfilled. And again, we'll have a whole lot more to say about this at a later time. Again, get yourself a copy of the book. So here we have Jesus saying that Israel would fill up, that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin by the end of the 70 weeks. He didn't say that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin before the end of the 70 weeks. Furthermore, pardon me, I even took an allergy pill this morning. Allergies are strong. Okay. So anyway, remember, let me reiterate this because you have to catch the power of it. Jesus did not say the measure of sin would be fulfilled either in his death or by the stoning of Stephen. It would be filled up in the killing of his apostles and prophets. Now, what did Paul say about this very idea? I introduced this in our last video, but again, that's been over a month ago. Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, you, brethren, became partakers of those of your brethren, you shared in the lot of your brethren in Judea, who are being persecuted by the Jews, as you also are being persecuted by your fellow countrymen. By the way, people try to say, well, Paul delineates between the Jews and the fellow countrymen of the Thessalonians. They couldn't be Jews. That's simply false. All you got to do is read Acts chapter 17, and you'll find out it was the Jews who instigated and perpetrated and did the persecuting. But Paul said, speaking of the Jews now, they both killed the prophets. That's what Jesus said in Matthew 23. That's what Stephen said in Acts chapter 7. Which of the prophets have you not slain? They have both slain the prophets. Now watch this. And they have killed the Lord. Okay. Well, doesn't that mean they had filled up the measure of their sin then? No. Watch. The apostles and prophets. Now watch this. This is what you've got to catch. So as to, which means they're killing us, the apostles and prophets, in order to fill up the measure of their sin always. Paul, what did you say? Paul said that the Jews were, when he wrote, after the cross, after the stoning of Stephen, when he wrote in 49 to 50 AD, he said the Jews were persecuted, killing the apostles and prophets, and in doing so, they were filling up the measure of their sin. And then he says, the wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost. The mental image that he uses there according to some Greek scholars, is of a humongous boulder. I've been watching some footage lately of flooding in different areas in which rivers are just raging. And here is a hillside, an entire hillside, humongous boulders, trees, even houses. And you can see them start to shake. You can see them start to shudder. And all of a sudden, they just come crashing down into the floodwaters. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the imagery of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16. The wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost. Why? Because they're killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus so as to fill up the measure of their sin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely, totally false to say that Israel had filled up the measure of their sin by killing Jesus. It is absolutely, totally false to say that Israel had filled up the measure of their sin by stoning Stephen. Let's just say that Stephen was an apostle. Let's just say that he was a prophet. It still doesn't mean that Israel had filled up the measure of their sin by stoning Stephen. Why? Because once again, 17 years later, let's just make it 20 years later to make it easy to remember, Paul said that Israel was, when he wrote 49 to 50 AD, Israel was filling up the measure of their sin. How? By killing the apostles and the prophets. That means, to reiterate, that means that Israel had not filled up the measure of their sin by killing Jesus. They had not filled up the measure of their sin by killing Stephen. That means the 70 weeks were not fulfilled in the stoning of Stephen. It means that it was going on at the time Paul wrote Thessalonians. But it wasn't fulfilled. It had yet to be fulfilled. And we'll talk about that next week. Hey, get yourself a copy of the book. You'll be glad you did. See you next week.